So today what we'll be doing is some fun little succulents or cactus in watercolor. So I already have a couple of those drawn on. When you're drawing on your little watercolor sketches, you can do that with a watercolor pencil or with kind of a light pencil like a 2H. So these were fairly simple, so I just kind of sketched them out onto my paper, but you can also do them on a separate piece of paper and then transfer them by putting 6B on the back of your drawing, just like you would transfer paper. So when I'm drawing these, first you want to kind of make sure that you have your paper fairly level if you want to have multiples, because you don't want to have a pot up here, a pot down here. That would look kind of weird. Unless they're like wildly growing somewhere. So sometimes it helps to kind of put a very light line where you're going to be putting all of your little pots. And I actually started by drawing out my cactus first and then did the pots to the shape. So I have a little inspiration sheet that has a couple different kinds of cactus on here. You could always, if you have a certain type of cactus you really want to do, you could always get your own for that. I just found these on the internet and they just had a variety of different kinds. So, you want to have a nice variety on your picture. You don't want to have 3 of the same kind. If they are the same, maybe make them different colors, or some could have little blossoms on them, some maybe not. So if you're doing the prickly pear cactus, I would kind of start by just very lightly drawing some little ovals. And prickly pear kind of grow in very interesting groupings. So if it's not exactly, like the picture, that's perfectly fine, because you can always find plants that are different. So try not to make it look too much like something else, because right now this looks like Mickey Mouse. So I would probably want to put a little bit more variety. Maybe have this one be 3, this one be 1. And then after that, I would start designing my pot. So it's really important to get kind of the perspective of the top of the pot correct. So instead of going really, really slow and drawing the top, a lot of times I'll draw it all in one go and go through my cactus. And then the rim on the sides is going to be straight. This area I would want to be curved. And then a lot of pots are kind of angled at the bottom, and you want these to be parallel, pretty similar, symmetrical to each other. And then I would have it nice and curved at the bottom. So that's how I would start, kind of very, very simple sketch. And you can draw that on also with watercolor pencil. These got a little bit too dark, but that's okay. I just wanted to make sure y'all could see them. And then what we're going to start off with first is doing some layers onto our little cactus. So I'm actually going to start with some brown first. And we're going to start off by working on our little prickly pear. So I'm going to be taking some dark brown, or whatever brown you have, and I'm just going to kind of go from the bottom area. I'm leaving a little bit of white space because this is going to be our dirt. So I don't want it to be just boring, filled in brown. So I try and leave some little highlights in the dirt. And then I'll take a little bit more of my paint, a little less water. And I'll just dab that in some areas. I'm not trying to touch it too much because you want to make it interesting and have a lot of kind of texture. And then on my prickly pears, I want to really think about where my light source is coming from. So kind of the direction that my sun is coming from. I'm going to say that my sun is coming from this direction. So what I'm going to do is start off with kind of a nice basic green, which for me is sap green. It's kind of a good base green. And some cactus are a little bit bluey, so I'm going to add a little bit of some blue, which this is phthalo blue, which makes it really, really blue. So if it gets too blue, I can add a little more green or even a little bit more yellow. So on my palette, I have a lot of different colors, but that isn't essential. Just with even a really simple palette that has at least one of each primary colors and a cool and a warm. So this is my warm red, and then this is my cool red. Same for my yellows. I have a cool yellow, and a warm yellow. So those are really important so you can get the wide spectrum of colors, but basically you don't need a million colors in your palette. I just happen to own a lot. So with my nice green, I'm just going to start it off with a really, really light wash. And when you're doing really light washes, you want to make sure that you're going and kind of doing long brush strokes using the body of the brush, you know, rather than doing lots and lots of touching and, you know, brushing, because that kind of ruins the natural kind of flow of watercolor. So if you wanted to, you could leave it really high contrast and leave, you know, kind of some sharp highlights, or you can kind of fill the whole entire thing with your green, which is what I'm almost going to do. And then, while that's still wet, I'm going to take a slightly darker version of that green, just by remixing, but taking a little bit more paint and less water to make a little bit of a darker green. And what I'm going to do now is, since I focused on this right here being where my light source is coming from, on the opposite side is where I'm going to start coming in and dropping in some dark green. And if it blends, that's perfectly fine, because that's what makes watercolor interesting. It's not having really sharp lines. So, and then, you know, just for fun, you could always throw in a different kind of green, or I could throw in some blue, kind of in the middle if it looks kind of boring. And I don't really want to touch, you know, the really, really wet parts of my painting, just because that's going to cause blossoms. And that's kind of where the paint is so wet, but you're adding more and more paint that it kind of rejects the whole entire thing. So I just added a little bit of blue in there. I could go over some of my highlights with that light wash of blue. And while that's drying, because I can't really go back in and add any of the spots right now or the prickles, just because it's really, really wet, I'm going to work on my pot for a little bit, because now my dirt's basically dry. So for my pot, I'm going to go with a traditional Terra Cotta Pot, which burnt sienna is a really great color for terracotta, but I want to add a little bit of yellow to it, which I'm using a little bit of yellow ochre. And it gets nice and bright. And same thing, I still want to think about where my light source is coming from, because that's going to affect my pot as well. So I'm coming in on the shadow side. With my pot, and then I'm going to take a little bit of water, and that'll help to kind of fade that terracotta color, so I have a nice little highlight on that side. And then I could take some purple or a dark brown. I kind of like using purple for shadows just because it makes it more interesting, and since purple is kind of the complement of yellow, it helps to kind of darken those colors without making them too dark. So I'm going to throw in some purple on this side. And it's fun to kind of embrace some of those little blossoms that are going to come up. Just because, you know, think about it, pots have a lot of texture to them. So if they have a little more extra texture, that's perfectly fine. So there you go. That's my just simple little pot. So while that was drying, you know, you could always add some more interesting things to your dirt. Maybe you don't like how white some of those highlights are. You could fill it in with maybe some yellow. And then the green is nearly done. So while I'm waiting for that to dry just a smidge more, I'm going to add some little blossoms. Which cactus blossoms can be pink, they can be red. I'm going to do mine kind of a fun orange, and I'm just kind of doing some small little strokes on the tips of some of these. And again, I'm not trying to touch them very much. And if you have a little bit of seepage, that's perfectly fine. I mean, if it bothers you, you can try and lift it, but most of the time it'll, you know, kind of take off some of that. But that's perfectly fine because watercolor is a very kind of loose medium. So you want to kind of let it do what it's going to do. So, and I'm going to take some darker green. I'm going to come in and add a little bit more shadows. And I can use a little bit of a wet brush to fade some of those edges. Almost said issues. That doesn't make any sense. So, and then once that would be completely dry, then I would start coming in with a really, really, really dark green, which you can darken green sometimes using alizarin crimson and some blue. You just have to make sure you don't get too much blue, or else it'll just turn, you know, bluey bluey. Da-da. So I'm just going to do some tiny little dots for some of those little prickly spots. So, and if some of these have gotten too dark, I can kind of lift a little bit with some water. Sometimes even just tapping them a little bit, but you have to make sure, again, you don't touch your watercolor too much, or else you'll lose some of the natural beauty of watercolor. There you go. So I kind of lighten some of those spots. I darken some of my little pot, and I could also kind of do a little shadow underneath my pot, or you could just leave the pot. So I'm going to take kind of a little Payne's gray and do a little bit underneath my pot. And I could have it kind of fade off to the side. And since I don't really want that harsh edge right there, I'm going to take a little bit of clean water and kind of fade the edges a little bit. There you go. So, and I can always come back in and start darkening some of those shadows, doing another little layer on my blossoms, which they look pretty dry. I could probably do that, a little bit of that. So I could just kind of do some more, maybe some little darker petals on top to add some variety. There you go. And then I would do the same thing for my other ones. You know, you might want to mix up the colors a little bit. Obviously, like all the cacti won't have these little prickly dots on here. So some of them have little pokers that come out. Some of them have nice little lines, which I'll actually kind of show y'all how to do some of those little lines. So if I had this little cactus, and I was just filling it in with a nice light layer of my green. See, and if I have this little line right here, I can have it blend off into some brown for my pot, or I could just leave it. But I kind of like the little fading look. And then to do some of those lines, you have to be careful, because if I do it when it's too wet, like right now, and I start drawing in some of those lines, they're going to kind of fade, which is a good way to kind of create lots of layers, but you have to be careful that you don't get too dark too soon, or else it's just going to blend and make everything the same value. So I would want to wait until this was dry and then very lightly come back over it with some of my small lines. So hopefully that helps, and you can now make your own little cacti or succulents.